No one believed her when she said that winter would be different. Sitting around the communal table, while the others debated about firewood supplies and basic door repairs, she mentioned the possibility of a prolonged snowstorm, with temperatures lower than the region had ever seen. The reaction was immediate. Sideways glances, stifled laughter, someone commenting that she always exaggerated, that she always saw danger where there was none. Her voice was lost in the murmur, as always happened. It wasn't anger she felt at that moment, but a subtle, familiar sadness, the certainty that she would be ignored until it was too late. The paradox was evident. She was right precisely because she thought differently, but she was discarded for exactly that reason. The cabin was a few kilometers from the village, isolated enough to offer privacy, yet close enough not to seem dangerous. It belonged to a man who used it as a seasonal refuge, a place where he stored tools, spent a few days during the harvest, or took shelter when the weather made it difficult to return home. She spent time there helping with small repairs, organizing provisions, cleaning the dusty wooden floor. While she worked, she observed, she noticed how the wind seeped in through the side cracks, how the roof creaked under the pressure of the accumulated snow, how the heat from the stove dissipated too quickly. The cabin was functional for normal seasons, but fragile for anything beyond that. No one else seemed to notice. She proposed the idea almost casually, as if it were a minor suggestion, to build an extra room under the floor, reinforced, insulated, prepared for extreme situations. The reaction was worse than silence. It was open disdain. They said it was a waste of time, that winter had never required more than firewood and thick blankets, that tampering with the cabin's structure was risky and unnecessary. Someone asked if she didn't trust her own resilience, if she thought she needed a hiding place to survive the cold. Another commented that she was creating non-existent problems, that she had always been like that, too nervous, too suspicious. She didn't answer, just nodded and left. But the decision had already been made. If no one was going to help, she would do it herself. The region where the cabin stood was marked by long silences and constant winds. The surrounding terrain stretched across gentle hills covered in low grass and scattered trees, which in winter transformed into twisted figures under layers of ice. The sky was too vast, almost oppressive in its grey expanse, and the cold arrived before the calendar suggested it, settling in with a persistence that seemed intentional. The cabin was situated on a slightly elevated spot, surrounded by loose stones and hard earth. The smell of the place varied according to the season. Damp wood in autumn, wood smoke in winter, turned earth in spring. It was an environment that demanded constant attention, where small oversights accumulated until they became serious problems. She knew that place better than most. She spent hours there, not for pleasure, but because it was where she felt least judged. In the community, her presence was tolerated, but rarely valued. She was seen as the young woman who asked uncomfortable questions, who pointed out risks no one wanted to hear about, who insisted on details that seemed irrelevant. She wasn't aggressive or confrontational, just too observant for the collective taste. She learned early on that her voice carried little weight in common decisions, that her concerns were treated as exaggeration or weakness. Over time, she stopped insisting, but she never stopped observing. And it was through observation that she realized what others ignored. The cabin wasn't prepared for a harsh winter. The emotional isolation she carried wasn't dramatic, but constant. There was no open resentment, only the silent awareness that she belonged on the margins. When she participated in regular meetings, she stood leaning against the wall while others debated around the table. Her suggestions were heard with superficial politeness and then quickly dismissed. She no longer expected to be taken seriously. What kept her there was practical logic. If the winter worsened, that cabin would be used, and if it were used under the current conditions, people would die. She couldn't control the weather, but she could control the preparedness. That's what motivated her, not heroism, but silent responsibility. The cabin was simple. Thick wooden walls, a sloping roof covered with metal shingles, a single front door, and 2 small windows. Inside, there was a main room with a wood-burning stove in the corner, some shelves fixed to the wall, a thin mattress on a raised platform, and tools hanging from hooks. The floor was made of wide, uneven planks that creaked underfoot. Natural light entered weakly, filtered by the dust that accumulated on the windows. The smell was of old wood, cold ashes, and rusty metal. During the day, the cold seeped in through the invisible cracks, and at night, even with the stove lit, the temperature plummeted quickly. It was a functional shelter for short visits, but vulnerable for prolonged stays. She knew every structural flaw in that cabin. She knew where the wind blew hardest, where moisture accumulated between the boards, where the weight of the snow pressed unevenly against the roof. She tested the floor with her feet, tapping lightly on different spots, listening to the resonance of the wood. Some areas sounded too hollow, others creaked under minimal pressure. The space under the floor was underutilized, serving only as an improvised storage for old tools and damp firewood, but she saw potential there. A space that, if reinforced and properly insulated, could function as a last resort. A place where the outside cold wouldn't hit so hard, where heat could be retained for longer, where people could stay alive even when everything around them failed. The idea wasn't born of fear, but of cold observation and practical calculation. The decision to build the underground room wasn't formally announced. It simply began. In the following days, she discreetly carried tools to the cabin: a short-handled shovel, a heavy hammer, treated wooden planks, makeshift thermal insulation bags made of compacted straw and thick fabric. She worked silently, always alone, taking advantage of periods when no one else was around. The idea was clear: to create a protected space under the floor, accessible only from the inside, invisible to anyone who didn't know it existed. It wasn't an ambitious project in size, but in function. It needed to be small enough to retain body heat, large enough to accommodate people in a seated position, and completely insulated from the outside cold. Every movement was calculated, every choice had a reason. She wasn't building a comfortable shelter. She was building a chance for survival. News of what she was doing spread quickly. Someone saw her carrying materials. Another noticed the muffled sound of hammering coming from the cabin at odd hours. When confronted, she explained simply. She was reinforcing the structure and creating extra space for emergencies. The reaction was immediate and unanimous. They said it was madness, that she was risking the integrity of the entire cabin because of unfounded paranoia. Someone commented that tampering with the floor could weaken the supporting beams. that the soil moisture would rise and rot the wood. Another stated that it was a waste of material that could be used for real necessary repairs. The word exaggeration reappeared, accompanied by condescending glances. She didn't argue, she just nodded and continued working. The risk perceived by the community wasn't in the construction itself, but in what it represented. Accepting that the space was necessary meant admitting that winter could be worse than they were prepared for. It meant acknowledging that the traditional way of dealing with the cold, firewood, blankets, physical resistance, might not be enough. And this attacked their collective pride. The community had survived for generations using the same methods, and questioning this was questioning the wisdom of the elders, the validity of past experiences. They weren't just building a secret room, they were, unintentionally, challenging the group's identity. And for that reason, even those who didn't care about the cabin began to criticize the project. It was an emotional rejection disguised as practical concern. There were attempts to persuade her to stop. Some people used a polite tone, suggesting she was tired, that perhaps she needed rest, that the winter was never as bad as she imagined. Others were more direct, saying she was creating problems where none existed, that she should rely more on collective experience and less on her own impressions. An older man stated that if the winter really worsened, they would do what they always did. They would come together, share resources, and face it together. The implicit message was clear. You don't need this because we already know what to do. She listened to everything in silence, with a neutral expression, without trying to justify herself. She knew that words wouldn't change anything, only reality would change. And when it did, it would be too late to begin preparing. Despite all the opposition, she persevered. The work was physically exhausting and emotionally isolating. Every plank lifted, every hole dug, every reinforcement installed was done under the invisible weight of collective judgment. She felt the disapproval in the air, in the interrupted conversations when she approached, in the glances exchanged when she carried materials. But logic was stronger than social discomfort. If the winter was severe and she had done nothing, people would die, and she would know she could have prevented it. If the winter was severe and she had prepared, perhaps she could have saved lives. The choice was obvious. The social cost was bearable. The guilt of not trying would not be. So she continued, day after day, alone, building something that everyone thought unnecessary, and that she hoped she would never need to use. The first step was to map the existing structure. She spent hours lying on her back under the cabin, illuminating the beams supporting the floor with an old flashlight. She counted each plank, measured the intervals between the supports, identified which points bore the most weight and which already showed signs of fatigue. The old wood creaked under minimal pressure, revealing its age and fragility. She noted everything in a small notebook, with simple drawings and approximate measurements. She wasn't an engineer, but she understood the basics: load distribution, stress points, the need for reinforcement. The space under the floor had an irregular height, varying between 60 centimeters and 1 meter, depending on the slope of the terrain. She chose the deepest area, near the center of the cabin, where the weight of the floor was distributed by more beams, and where access could be camouflaged under the worn carpet that covered part of the floor. The excavation began in the late afternoon, when natural light still filtered weakly through the windows. She removed 3 wide planks from the floor, creating a rectangular opening approximately 1 meter by 80 centimeters. The sound of the wood being lifted echoed dryly in the silence of the cabin. Below, the earth was compacted, hard, mixed with small stones and fine roots. She dug with short, controlled movements, removing the earth in buckets which she emptied away from the cabin, spreading it out to leave no obvious traces. The smell of damp earth rose strongly, mixed with the odor of old wood and accumulated dust. Her hands became dirty, calloused, with small cuts that stung as sweat dripped. The work was slow but progressive. Each bucket removed increased the depth of the hole, creating enough space for a person to sit without hitting their head on the beams above. After digging about 1.5 meters deep, she began the structural reinforcement. She installed additional beams parallel to the existing ones, distributing the weight more evenly and preventing the floor from collapsing under future pressure. She used long, sturdy nails, hammering them in with firm blows that resonated muffledly in the wood. Each new beam was tested before being permanently fixed. She would climb onto the floor, walk over the modified area, and jump lightly to check for excessive movement. The floor needed to look identical to the rest of the cabin, with no perceptible differences to the eye or to walk on. Any flaw in the camouflage would render the space useless. She knew that if anyone discovered the existence of the room before the right time, the social pressure would intensify, and she might be forced to undo everything. The thermal insulation was designed in layers. First, he lined the earthen walls with thin, moisture-treated boards, creating a solid barrier that prevented direct contact with the frozen ground. Then, he filled the spaces between the boards and the earth with compacted dry straw mixed with old, thick fabrics he had managed to gather. The straw acted as a natural insulator, creating air pockets that hindered the passage of cold. On top of the straw, he fixed another layer of wood, forming a double wall. The same process was applied to the ceiling of the underground room, the lower part of the cabin floor. There, insulation was even more critical, as it needed to retain the heat rising from people's bodies and prevent the cold from the floor above from descending. He used thick felt, obtained from old frayed blankets, and covered everything with a thin, waterproof tarp to prevent moisture infiltration. Ventilation was the most delicate technical challenge. A closed underground space would accumulate carbon dioxide quickly, especially if several people were there for hours. She needed an air intake that wouldn't reveal the existence of the room and wouldn't allow snow or icy wind to enter. The solution was to create a narrow, discreet duct that ran up the inside side of the cabin, camouflaged behind a fixed shelf, and ended in a small opening near the ceiling, disguised as a natural crack in the wood. The duct was made of thin, interlocking metal tubes with gentle curves to prevent blockage by condensation or snow. At the bottom, inside the room, she installed a fine screen to prevent insects or debris from entering. The airflow would be minimal, but sufficient to keep oxygen circulating without cooling the environment. The access point was designed to be invisible and functional. She cut one of the floorboards so that it could be removed and replaced without leaving obvious marks. The board was secured underneath with simple metal hinges, allowing it to be lifted like a horizontal door. Above it, she fixed small fasteners that could only be unlocked from inside the underground room ensuring that no one would accidentally fall into the hole and that access was controlled. To camouflage the opening, she positioned the old rug exactly over the movable board. When the rug was in place, it was impossible to notice any difference. She tested the mechanism several times, going in and out, checking if she could close the access from the inside and open it again without difficulty. Everything worked precisely and silently. Inside the room, she organized basic survival supplies. She stacked cans of non-perishable food, beans, corn, canned dried meat, on a makeshift shelf made of wooden crates. She stored bottles of water in a corner, protected from direct contact with the cold floor by a raised wooden base. She left thick candles, matches stored in waterproof containers, and 2 oil lanterns with fuel reserves. She included folded, heavy blankets, which could be used for both warmth and to further insulate the space. Everything was organized compactly, making use of every available inch without creating visual clutter. It wasn't about comfort, it was about efficiency. Each item had a clear and immediate function. Nothing there was decorative or dispensable. The final step was to create an alternative heat source that didn't rely on an open fire, since the smoke would reveal the presence of the room and the risk of asphyxiation in an enclosed space was real. She improvised small hand warmers using smooth stones that, when preheated on the cabin stove and wrapped in thick fabric, released heat for hours. She prepared several stones the size of closed fists, storing them in a canvas bag inside the room. The idea was simple. If the cold became unbearable downstairs, the heated stones could be placed near the bodies, inside the blankets, maintaining a bearable temperature without the risk of fire or smoke. It was an old, almost primitive, but reliable solution, and reliability was all that mattered in that context. If you've been following along this far, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. This helps us continue sharing stories like this. Winter arrived on schedule, with the first gusts of cold wind cutting through the air at the end of autumn. The temperature dropped gradually, almost politely, following a pattern the community knew well. The days grew shorter, the sunlight lost its strength and acquired a pale, distant tone. The trees around the cabin lost their last leaves, becoming bare and twisted against the grey sky. The ground hardened under the first layer of morning frost, which melted at midday and froze again at night. It was a familiar, predictable cold that validated the collective confidence. People commented that it would be just another normal winter, repeating the phrase like a comforting mantra. She listened and said nothing. She simply observed the signs that others ignored. The snow began to fall lightly, in small flakes that danced in the air before settling on the ground. Initially, it accumulated little, a thin layer that covered the grass and disappeared under the weak sun of the following morning. The children played in the freshly fallen snow, shaping imperfect snowballs and leaving trails of footsteps through the village. The adults reinforced the wood piles, checked the doors and windows, adjusted the blankets on the beds. Everything followed the familiar ritual, the standard preparation that had always been sufficient. In the cabin, the wood stove was lit during the night, keeping the interior warm enough so that the cold did not become uncomfortable. The smell of wood smoke spread through the region, marking the official start of the season. No one seemed worried. Everything was under control. but small details began to deviate from the norm. The snow that fell in the morning didn't melt completely by the afternoon, leaving white residue accumulated in the shaded corners. The nighttime temperature dropped faster than expected, reaching levels that usually only appeared weeks later. The wind changed direction, now coming from the north in longer, sharper gusts that penetrated the cracks in the buildings with increasing insistence. She noticed these changes while working in the cabin, feeling the cold seep in under the door even with the stove lit, hearing the wind whistling through the windows more sharply than usual. They were subtle signs, easily dismissed as natural variations, but together they formed a worrying pattern. The electricity supply, which was already unreliable in the region even under normal conditions, began to fail more frequently. Short blackouts became common, lasting a few hours before the power returned. People complained, but without real alarm. It was inconvenient, not dangerous. Candles and oil lamps were placed in easily accessible positions, and life continued without major adjustments. However, the reliance on electric heating in some homes began to show its limitations. Families who had relied on portable heaters started using wood-burning stoves more intensively, burning through their stocks faster than planned. No one openly voiced their concern, but there was a growing tension in the air, a diffuse feeling that something was not in line with the expected normality. The paths between the village and the more isolated areas, including the cabin, began to become more difficult to traverse. The accumulated snow made walking slower and more tiring, requiring extra effort for each movement. The narrow trails became slippery under the mixture of compacted snow and thin ice. Some people began to avoid unnecessary trips, preferring to stay close to home as the cold intensified. She observed all this with silent attention, realizing that the physical isolation of the cabin was naturally increasing. If the winter truly worsened, that place would become completely inaccessible for days or weeks. And if anyone were inside when that happened, they would depend exclusively on the resources available on site. The underground room, which everyone had ridiculed, was beginning to make sense more and more clearly. But she didn't mention it. She just waited, prepared, knowing that reality would do the convincing work that her words never could. The real change began one morning without warning. The snow that had fallen overnight didn't stop at dawn. It continued to descend in dense, heavy flakes, accumulating quickly on roofs, fences, and paths. The wind picked up, transforming the snowfall into horizontal gusts that reduced visibility to just a few meters. The sky lost any variation in color, becoming a uniform mass of dark gray that seemed to weigh down on the earth. The temperature plummeted abruptly, breaking historical records for the region. The cold was now not just uncomfortable, it was aggressive, penetrating, the kind that burned exposed skin and made breathing difficult. People began to realize that this was no ordinary winter. Worried comments replaced the previous confidence. Someone mentioned that they had never seen snow accumulate so quickly. Another said that the firewood supplies might not be enough if this continued. In the village, the first structural flaws began to appear. The weight of the snow accumulated on the roofs caused cracks in old beams, and some houses had to be hastily shored up with makeshift planks. The electricity supply collapsed completely, not temporary blackouts, but a total absence of power. The lights went out and didn't come back on. Electric heaters became useless. Entire families gathered around wood-burning stoves, burning wood at an accelerated pace to maintain internal warmth. But the stoves were not designed for continuous and intense heating. Some began to malfunction, drafts clogged with creosote, doors that wouldn't close properly, grates cracked by excessive heat. The smell of smoke intensified, mixed with the odor of green wood being burned for lack of alternatives. The feeling of control began to dissolve. The paths became impassable. The accumulated snow reached heights that blocked doors and windows at ground level. Moving between buildings required clearing a path with shovels, an exhausting task that consumed energy and temporarily warmed the body, but which needed to be repeated every few hours as the snow continued to fall. The trail to the cabin disappeared completely under a uniform white layer. No one could go there anymore to check the conditions. The cabin was isolated, invisible in the snowy landscape, accessible only to those who were already inside when the blockage began. She had gone there 2 days before the blizzard intensified, bringing some more provisions and checking one last time that everything was working. Now she was trapped there, alone but prepared. Inside the cabin, the cold began to overcome the traditional defenses. The wood-burning stove, even when constantly lit, couldn't maintain the internal temperature above a few degrees. The heat rose directly to the ceiling and escaped through the invisible cracks in the old structure. The walls froze from the inside, forming thin layers of ice in the corners where the dampness froze. The wind penetrated through the sides of the door, whistling low and constantly, bringing gusts of icy air that cut through the room. She wore thick layers of clothing, but even so, she felt the cold penetrate her bones. At night, the temperature inside the cabin dropped so low that breathing hurt, and the vapor from her breath immediately condensed in the air. Sleeping became difficult. Her body trembled involuntarily, and the cold woke her up before exhaustion completely overcame her. The firewood, which had seemed abundant at first, began to be consumed at an alarming rate. She burned larger logs and faster than planned, trying to compensate for the cabin's thermal inefficiency. But she realized that at that rate, the stock would run out in a few days, and there was no way to get more. Going out to get firewood meant facing blizzards, risking freezing, and possibly getting lost on the way back. She made quick mental calculations. If she rationed the firewood drastically, keeping the stove lit for only a few hours a day, she might be able to extend the stock for a week. But that meant spending most of the time in extreme cold, which could lead to hypothermia. The mathematics of survival was beginning to show its cruel limits. In the village, the situation deteriorated similarly. Messages exchanged before the complete breakdown of communication revealed that several families were facing the same problems. Dwindling firewood supplies, houses unable to retain heat, and children and the elderly beginning to show signs of mild hypothermia. Some people tried to move to neighboring houses to share resources, but the physical exertion of walking through the deep snow, combined with the extreme cold, made every movement dangerous. There were reports of someone who went out to seek help and had to turn back halfway, with frozen fingers and increasing disorientation. The collective pride that had previously dismissed concerns now became a silent burden. No one wanted to admit they had underestimated the threat, but everyone knew. The cabin began to show signs of structural stress. The weight of the snow accumulated on the roof pressed against the supporting beams, which creaked softly and continuously throughout the night. Small cracks appeared at the joints between the boards, allowing the wind to penetrate even more forcefully. One of the windows, whose frame had been loose for years, began to vibrate under the wind pressure, producing a sharp, irregular sound that wouldn't stop. She tried to reinforce the window with boards nailed from the outside, but the biting cold made manual work difficult. Her fingers lost feeling too quickly, and holding the hammer firmly became impossible after a few minutes. Each small repair required multiple attempts, pauses to warm her hands, and frustrated returns to the unfinished work. The critical point was inevitably approaching. The snow continued to fall relentlessly. The cold intensified each night, and resources were dwindling at an accelerated pace. She looked at the rug covering the entrance to the underground room and knew she would soon have to make a decision. She could continue trying to survive on the main level of the cabin, burning the remaining firewood and hoping winter would recede before it was too late. Or she could descend to the space she had prepared, where the thermal insulation was superior, where body heat would be retained more efficiently, where resources were organized to last longer. Logic pointed to the second option, but there was emotional resistance. Going down to that space would mean admitting that the situation was out of control, that the traditional method had completely failed. It was accepting that she had always been right and that everyone else was wrong. And this truth, even unspoken, weighed strangely on her chest. Sometimes we prepare something we hope we'll never need to use. If this story resonates with you in any way, please consider subscribing to the channel. It makes a difference in allowing us to continue sharing stories like this. The change began with knocking on the cabin door. Weak, irregular knocks, almost inaudible over the sound of the wind. She rose from her huddled position near the nearly extinguished stove and walked to the entrance, struggling to push the door against the accumulated snow outside. When she managed to open a crack, she saw 3 snow-covered figures, visibly shivering, with pale faces and purplish lips. They were people from the village, a middle-aged man, a young woman, and a teenager. They had tried to cross to the cabin seeking shelter after the house where they were began to collapse under the weight of the snow on the roof. The walk had been brutal. Soaked clothes, numb fingers, evident physical exhaustion. They didn't ask permission. They just stumbled in, searching for any source of warmth. And as they looked around, they realized what she already knew. The cabin was failing too. The man spoke first, his voice hoarse and broken by the cold. He asked how long the firewood would last, if there was enough food, if there was anywhere else they could take better shelter. She answered with direct honesty. The firewood would run out in less than a day if they kept the stove lit for 4 people. Food was limited, and the structure of the cabin was under increasing pressure. Then, for the first time, she mentioned the space under the floor. The reaction was one of silent surprise. The man frowned, trying to process the information. The woman looked at the floor, as if she could see through the planks. The teenager just trembled, too weak to question. There was no mockery, no disbelief, just the slow, heavy realization that this ridiculed preparation was now the only real option for survival. The woman was the first to verbalize what everyone felt. She said, in a low, embarrassed voice, that she should have listened sooner, that she had laughed when she heard about the project, thinking it was unnecessary exaggeration. that now she understood that the difference between living and dying could lie precisely in what others dismissed as madness. It wasn't a formal apology, but a raw acknowledgement of reality. The young woman didn't respond with satisfaction or resentment. He simply nodded slightly and said they needed to go down before the cold completely incapacitated them. The collective pride, which had sustained the rejection for weeks, crumbled at that moment. Not with drama, but with the simple acceptance that survival was more important than being right. The man asked, with visible hesitation, if there was enough space for everyone. She explained that the room had been designed for emergencies exactly like this one, small but functional for up to 5 people in a cramped sitting or lying position. It wouldn't be comfortable, but it would be safe. He looked at the other 2 and then back at her and asked the question none of them dared to verbalize directly. Why was she willing to share that space with someone who had ridiculed her work? Her answer was simple and direct. She said she hadn't built it out of pride or to prove she was right. She had built it because it was necessary, and if it was necessary, then it needed to work for whoever needed it, regardless of who they were. The logic was cold, but honest, and in that context, honesty was worth more than any elaborate emotional reconciliation. She lifted the old rug covering the entrance, revealing the special floorboard. The others watched silently as she unhooked the discreet fasteners underneath, using her fingers to locate the small metal latches visible only to those who knew where to look. The board rose with a soft creak, opening like a horizontal door. A short, makeshift ladder made of wooden steps fixed to the reinforced earthen wall descended into the darkness. The air rising from the room was different, denser, smelling of dry earth and treated wood, but noticeably less cold than the air in the cabin. She went down first, lighting an oil lamp that illuminated the small, organized space. Shelves with cans, water bottles, folded blankets, candles in rows. Everything exactly as she had left it. The others followed, moving with difficulty due to the cold that had stiffened their muscles. When everyone was inside, she locked the entrance from the inside, using the locking mechanism that prevented any accidental opening. The space was cramped, but functionally organized. 4 people sat down, occupying almost all the available area, their backs against the double walls of insulated wood. The low ceiling forced a hunched posture for anyone trying to stand, but seated, there was enough height to avoid feeling crushed. The temperature, though still cold, was noticeably higher than in the hut above. The thermal insulation worked. The frozen earth outside couldn't penetrate the layers of straw, wood, and felt. The body heat began to slowly accumulate in the air, trapped by the enclosed space and the double walls. She distributed heavy blankets, instructing each person to wrap themselves completely in them, creating an additional layer of insulation. Then, using the stones he had prepared weeks before, he quickly climbed to the hut above, heated 3 large stones on the still-lit stove, and descended with them wrapped in thick fabric. He positioned the stones in the center of the group, where the heat radiated gently, noticeably increasing the internal temperature. The ventilation worked as planned. The narrow duct brought in fresh air from the cabin's ceiling, flowing slowly but steadily. The temperature difference between the cold outside air and the warmer inside created a natural circulation. The cold air descended through the duct, forcing the stale air to rise and escape through the small gaps she had intentionally left at the top of the vent. It wasn't a sophisticated system, but it was effective. After a few hours, the air inside the room remained breathable, without the feeling of suffocation or excessive carbon dioxide buildup. She monitored the others closely, watching for signs of dizziness or difficulty breathing that would indicate ventilation failure. But everyone was breathing normally, and color was beginning to return to their previously pale faces. The system was working. Outside, the storm reached its peak. The wind howled with unprecedented force, shaking the structure of the cabin above. They heard the deep creaks of the beams pressed against the snow, the sound of small branches breaking and being hurled against the outer walls, the sharp whistling of the wind penetrating through the cracks. At one point, there was a loud, dry crack. One of the cabin windows gave way under pressure, shattering and allowing snow and wind to rush in with full force. The cold invaded the space above, rendering the cabin uninhabitable. If they had been up there at that moment, they would already be suffering from advanced hypothermia. But down below, protected by the layers of insulation and the surrounding earth, the impact was minimal. They felt a slight drop in temperature, but nothing comparable to the thermal collapse occurring a few meters above them. The young woman rationed the supplies with calculated precision. She distributed small portions of canned dried meat and hard biscuits, enough to maintain energy without wasting resources. Water was carefully measured. Each person received half a cup every 4 hours, enough to prevent dehydration without depleting reserves too quickly. She explained that if the storm continued for 3 days, the supplies there would last exactly that long with strict rationing. If it lasted longer, they would have to reduce the portions even further. No one complained. Hunger and thirst were uncomfortable, but bearable. Freezing would be fatal. The choice was obvious. They ate in silence, chewing slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a complete meal. Gratitude was not expressed in words, but it was present in the care with which they treated each available resource. The hours dragged on with heavy slowness. There was no natural light, so time became abstract, measured only by the burning of the candles and the rotation of the heated stones. When a stone cooled completely, she would climb back up to the ruined hut, braving the brutal cold for a few minutes. Heat another stone on the stove that miraculously still had embers, and quickly return to the shelter. Each climb was a calculated risk. Staying too long in the cold above meant losing body heat that would take hours to recover. But without the heated stones, the room's temperature would slowly drop until it became dangerous. It was a delicate balance between necessity and risk, and she managed this balance with the same cold logic she had used to build everything. There was no room for error, and she didn't make mistakes. The storm receded on the morning of the 4th day. The wind gradually lost strength, the gusts spaced out, and the constant sound of snow pounding against the cabin finally ceased. When she climbed up one last time to check on the conditions, she found the cabin transformed. The broken window had allowed a massive amount of snow to enter, which now piled up in mounds inside the main room, covering part of the floor and freezing in hard layers. The stove was out and cold, the remaining firewood covered in ice. The internal temperature was brutally low, unsuitable for human life without extreme protection. But outside, through the jagged opening where the window had been, the sky showed a pale band of blue. The blizzard had stopped. They had survived. And they survived because a space that everyone considered unnecessary had functioned exactly as it was designed to function. When they returned to the village in the following days, carrying their last supplies and trudging through the deep snow, they were met with a mixture of relief and awkward silence. Other families had survived, but with losses and lasting effects. Cases of frostbite on fingers and ears, severe hypothermia still requiring recovery, serious structural damage to several houses. The story of what happened in the cabins spread quickly. How the underground room had kept 4 people alive while the structure above collapsed. How every prepared detail had been essential. How the difference between life and death had been determined by a choice that everyone ridiculed. The young woman didn't tell this story heroically or vengefully. She simply recounted the facts when asked. The space worked because it was designed to work, and it would work again if necessary. The change in the treatment she received was subtle but definitive. In subsequent meetings, when she spoke about preparedness or future risks, people listened with genuine attention. No one interrupted with irony. No one dismissed her concerns as exaggeration. There was a silent understanding that her way of seeing the world, observant, calculating, prepared, had real practical value. The cabin was repaired in the following weeks, but access to the underground room was maintained and even improved, with a more accessible entrance and permanently stocked supplies. Others began to apply similar logic to their own homes, creating isolated spaces, reinforcing structures, thinking beyond the known standard. The legacy was not the physical structure, but the lesson absorbed. Survival does not depend on bravery or blind tradition, but on seeing what others ignore and preparing before it is too late. Stories like this remind us that sometimes being prepared is what separates the possible from the impossible. If you've made it this far, subscribe to follow more stories like this.